We interact with strangers every single day. Everyone is a stranger before that first conversation. Then we call them acquaintances, friends, or our significant other. We shouldn't have to be fearful of other human beings, but some of them are monsters hiding behind smiling faces. And for some people, by the time they find out, it's already too late. Deadly Deep Dives. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kimbyrleigha. If you've never been here before, nice to finally meet you. A big thanks to Audible for sponsoring today's video. Stories are part of all of our lives. Storytelling goes back thousands of years, and every week you come back to listen to me tell a story that moves you emotionally, mentally, and sometimes physically. The way that we listen to stories has evolved, which has made it easier for us to learn, be entertained, or just escape the world for a moment in time. I need to escape to distress and indulge, but because I'm so busy, I wouldn't be able to enjoy as many titles if it wasn't for Audible. It's the best place to listen to a variety of stories in different formats like audiobooks or podcasts to exclusive Audible originals in every genre that you can think of, from self-help to science fiction to, of course, true crime and mysteries. You're bound to find something to listen to, and it's all in one place, which makes it super convenient for our busy lives. I've been getting a lot done this summer. One of the biggest projects that I've been working on is building my new podcast set, and listening to titles on Audible keeps me motivated. Right now, I'm nearly halfway through with the original story that inspired the horror movie I Know What You Did Last Summer. Not only is it reminiscent of the 90s, which takes me back in time, but I covered the real-life murder of the author's daughter, Caitlin Arquette, on this channel. Listening on Audible is great for helping pass the time, whether you're working on a project, doing laundry, watering your plants, or putting all of your kids' new school clothes away. I can't believe that back to school is right around the corner. I've also been working in some downtime because self-care is so important, so I made a routine to spend some time at the pool relaxing, taking in some much-needed vitamin D, and Audible is right there keeping me entertained or helping me learn from anywhere. I started listening to this Audible original podcast by Mel Robbins called Reinvent Your Life. It helps me be confident and motivated even on my worst days. I just open up Audible, pop in my AirPods, and I'm instantly in a better state of mind. New members can try Audible free for 30 days. Just visit audible.com/Kimber or text Kimber to 500-500 to try Audible free for 30 days. And as an Audible member, you can choose one title a month to keep from their entire catalog, including the latest bestsellers and new releases, which means you can discover new titles to download and stream all the time. That's exciting. Maybe you want to jump into something you don't normally listen to, or formats that you've never tried, like words and music series. I started listening to Upon Reflection by Sting. I would highly recommend it. So no matter what it is you're into, Audible's ever-growing selection makes being a member an incredible value. So look for the link below, and as a new member, try Audible free for 30 days. Don't miss out. Join me and become a member today. Thanks again for Audible for sponsoring this channel and making today's video possible. Now let's get into the story for today. So I stumbled upon this case when I was watching some updates on the Long Island serial killer case. Now, if you have not heard about that case, there were a series of murders that occurred between the years of 1996 and 2011. The remains of up to 18 people were found on the South Shore of Long Island, New York. Specifically, the remains of several sex workers who were found wrapped in burlap sacks and buried in an area called Gilgo Beach. Because of the similarities between the way they were disposed of and the circumstances surrounding who they were and their lifestyle, it was suspected that a serial killer may be responsible for at least 4 of these murders. The remains could have been left uncovered if it wasn't for the disappearance of a woman named Shannon Gilbert. She went missing in the early morning hours of May 1st, 2010, after making a 911 call, telling the operator that someone was out to get her. When they looked in the area where Shannon was last seen, also a sex worker, authorities with cadaver dogs uncovered the bodies of 4 other sex workers who became known as the Go-Go 4. They are Megan Waterman, 22 years old, Melissa Bartholomew, 24, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who's 25 when she was killed, and Amber Lynn Costello, who was 27 years old. This past month of July, on the 19th, 2023, a 59-year-old architect, married, father of two, working in Manhattan, was arrested and is currently being detained and investigated for his involvement in the Gilgo Beach serial killings. I am following that case and all the developments very closely, and this case is not related today. But when I was searching the serial murders that occurred in Long Island, a place that I've never talked about on this channel as far as I can recall, this case came up because it happened there as well. I debated doing this case. It's talked about on other channels before, and I usually try to focus on lesser known cases, but when I really started digging in, I felt like many of the articles just scratched the surface of the person who lost their life in such a horrific manner. Later in this video, you'll know why I didn't just decide to do this case. I had to do it. That's something inside me. I stopped what I was working on and I focused all of my attention on everything I could learn about what happened. And also through my diligent research, I hope to dispel some rumors that I've seen about this case. It's one of those cases where a lot was left in the imagination in the news and elsewhere in the media, and that leaves room for speculation, which can breed judgment. There's no place for that when we're talking about someone we have never met. You'll know exactly what I mean once we get into it. I'm telling you, I expect you to have strong opinions one way or the other. Today I'm taking you to, of course, as I mentioned, Long Island, New York. One reason it's so important for me to understand locations is because I'm a very visual person. Things don't always make sense to me unless I can see how they're all mapped out. The pieces just come together once I understand where things took place. I've never been to Long Island, although I love New York, but Long Island is exactly what it sounds like. It's a piece of land in the state of New York that's surrounded by water, and instead of being a small round island, it's a long island, so there you go. But there's much more to it than that, especially since it's central to this case, and of course, the Long Island serial killer case. Long Island itself is famous for other things besides unsolved murders. For example, the beautiful coastlines. They've been called some of the best beaches in the world: Jones Beach, Long Beach, and Fire Island. And it has a variety of other natural attractions like forests, lakes, and wineries. And it makes a great vacation destination. And also, since there are a lot of places that have a lower cost of living than New York City, but are close enough to get there, it's only about an hour drive away, it's ideal for commuters who work in the city. The neighborhoods are known to be both safe and exciting, with a lot to do. And as you get closer to the tip of the island, you find places like the Hamptons. I'm sure you've heard of the Hamptons before. It's a group of towns, villages, and hamlets on the eastern end of Long Island. And the Hamptons are described as a popular seaside resort town with iconic mansion neighborhoods and a wild nightlife. And I'm very curious as to what that means. If you're familiar with it, let me know in the comments. Many celebrities have summer homes in the Hamptons, like Beyonce and Jay-Z and Alec Baldwin, just to name a few. But as you get more inland and closer to the city, there are very diverse pockets and lifestyles at different income levels. Today, I'm taking you to Medford. It's a blue-collar hamlet on Long Island, and a hamlet is just smaller than a town or a village. It's about 10 square miles, and the population is at around 20,000. Medford is full of modest homes with hard-working people residing in a close-knit community, and we will be talking about one of those families today. I want to introduce you to Rebecca Koster. Her friends and her family refer to her as Becky and Becca, among other things like cute pet names, Becca Boo, and Becky Boo like her mom would call her. She was born on June 12, 1985, a June baby like myself. Her mother, Barbara Miller, was beyond enamored looking into her newborn baby girl's eyes for the very first time. Barbara said from the minute she came into this world, Becky was just the sweetest thing. I mean, look at those big, beautiful eyes, those cute pouty lips, a head full of dark hair, and her olive skin. She was her mother's joy. She brightened her life and the world as soon as she entered it. As Becky got older, she remained having that sweet disposition and kind nature. Barbara noticed that Becky wouldn't even hurt the smallest creature. She said she couldn't even hurt a fly. When Becky was 9, her brother Damien was born, and that's when Barb said, then the two of them became a trio, and it was a lot of fun. Barbara was very close to her children, especially Becky, having all those years with her before Damien came along. Her world revolved around giving Becky the best that she could. They were more than just mother and daughter. They were best friends. Barbara was a single mom until she met and fell in love with Larry Ross. They hit it off and had so much in common and were definitely very much in love. Both he and Becky had June birthdays, so many times the family would celebrate them together. Here's one of those birthday cakes with Larry and Becky's picture on it. Larry considered Becky his daughter, even though he wasn't her biological father. The family was very close. Ultimately, Barbara Miller became Barbara Ross when she married Larry, and Becky looked gorgeous as she watched her mother exchange vows with Larry, now officially her stepdad. And Becky and her mom loved roses. It was their favorite flower, and I know that I've said this before, call me basic, it's mine too. Becky wore a pretty pink rose flower crown to her mother's wedding. Pink was also her favorite color. Many times she would wear pink eyeshadow, nails, jewelry, heels. She was definitely a girly girl. She also loved butterflies. In these pictures, you can just tell she just radiates happiness. She and Damien look so adorable, and I can tell how excited Becky was for her mother's wedding. This embrace says it all. They just rocked back and forth, hugging on the dance floor, a little mother-daughter dance. They lived on Falcon Avenue in Medford. Larry worked as a truck part salesman, Barbara worked shifts at the hospital, and Becky attended Patchogue Medford High School, only 9-minute drive from their house. And when she was 14 years old, she met Nicole Longo. Nicole was new to the area at the time, but she was so happy to have met Becky because they became inseparable. They were truly best friends, and over the years they grew up together, and Nicole called Becky her soulmate. She didn't think that soulmates only referred to someone's boyfriend or husband or partner. Instead, Nicole believed that soulmates can be anyone that you have such a strong, unbreakable connection with, and that's what these two girls had. They bonded over what most high schoolers do. Sleepovers where they would stay up all night talking to each other until they fell asleep, walking around the neighborhood at night with other girls just laughing, making memories, inside jokes. And Becky was a loyal friend. She was always there when you needed her, even if it was just to help pass some time in detention. Yes, she sat through Nicole's detentions with her, and that made them a lot more tolerable. Becky was always by her side through thick and thin. She was easy to get along with because she saw the good in everyone. She quickly merged into Nicole's friend group as well. At first, Nicole's friends from back home, like another friend, Nikki, was sad when Nicole moved away. But when she introduced Nikki to Becky, the move was worth it because they gained another amazing friend. Soon, the three of them became the two Nicks and Becca. Over the years, they formed a core group of friends and hung out all the time. Becky enjoyed helping others. It either came naturally to her or it could have been something to do with her mom, because Barb was a CNA, a certified nursing assistant, and it's not an easy job. It takes a lot of patience and being very helpful, a loving person that cares for others, and that's part of who Barbara was. That seemed to rub off on Becky. She would happily babysit her mom's friends' kids, help braid her friends' hair when they came over to hang out, and even babysit for some of her friends' kids as they got older and started families of their own. But Becky, she just had the look and the personality that left an impression on people, even ones she barely knew. If you met her even once, you would remember her face. She was what people would call unforgettable. That cute, freckled face, bubbly personality, it definitely attracted the boys as well, and Becky was no stranger to having boyfriends. The guys were always trying to flirt and talk and date Becky. She was very popular and gorgeous, but humble. Her friends would tell her how pretty she was all the time and how other girls were jealous of her. But once they got to know her, they couldn't stay jealous because she was just too nice. After high school, Becky decided she wanted to work in the healthcare industry alongside her mom at the hospital. So she too studied to become a CNA, passed a test, and landed a job in the cardiology department at the same hospital in the same department as her mother. Becky and Barbara lived together. They worked together. They hung out together. People saw them more like sisters than mother and daughter. When they weren't putting in the long hours at the hospital, they were shopping together. They were cooking, curled up next to one another on the couch, watching a movie. Becky always confided in her mother. And as she got older and more independent, she still made sure to keep in touch with her mom every single day. She'd let her know her plans, where she would be, when she would be coming home, and call or text her when she got back from anywhere, running errands, going out with friends. She made even more friends at work. One of them was Jamie Redis, who was just drawn to Becky right away. Because of her bubbly, warm personality, they became instant friends. And Jamie admired the way that Becky treated every patient like it was her own family member. It showed that she was a genuinely loving person. In 2006, when Becky was 21, she dated a guy named Jay, but it didn't last that long. And as Becky progressed in life, her standards got higher. Her and her friends would joke when they went out that they only talked to guys who had business cards, and they were just being cute and cheeky. But Becky was known for her witty banter, cracking jokes, and making her friends laugh. She was the friend that would get out there on the dance floor by herself and do silly things to make everyone smile. She made things fun. Friends said you couldn't be sad around Becky. It was impossible. She would find a way to cheer you up. That's why so many people gravitated towards her. She just didn't have a bad day. She knew how to be grateful, and many people would turn to her when they needed uplifting or positivity in their lives. Case in point, there were times Becky would steal some bologna from her mom's sandwiches, hide it in her purse for later, and then when she was hanging out with her friends, she would just magically slip this piece of bologna out of her bag and start munching on it. And they'd be like, "Where did that come from?" And she would grab some from her purse and say, "Right here, you want some bologna?" I can just picture her saying this with this big smile and just laughing. It's like she created those try not to laugh moments without even trying. People want to be around someone who makes them feel good, and she did everything with her girls. They even got matching tongue piercings. I remember how popular that was in the 2000s. I had one too. Hers was pink with a butterfly on it, combining two of her favorite things. She definitely had a spunky personality and a sense of humor. Here she is on her 23rd birthday in June of 2008, decked out in everything pink, the earrings, the tank top, the heels. She loved fashion. She would talk about her dream of either being a painter or designing her own club fashion clothing line. And jokingly, she said she would call it skank attire. Even though her friends knew she was joking, they knew she would be great at whatever she chose to do. By 2009, Becky was 24 and single again. That was okay because she had a lot of other things going on. Her main focus was work and, of course, spending time with family and friends. She had a very active social life. Her close-knit group of friends loved going out to local bars for some drinks and dancing. It was a routine for them. When they had free time, they would take the opportunity to get together and meet up. And it's usually a town away in Holbrook, just a 5-minute drive from Medford. There was an Irish pub they like to go to called the Irish Times, an ale house called Kelly's, and one of their other go-to places for a bite to eat, playing some pool and drinks, was called Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill. I think it's pretty similar to what most of us enjoy. Good food, friends, and fun times. Friends would say that they like to have a joke and a smoke. And speaking of which, I'm going to address it now. Remember I told you that there have been a lot of judgment surrounding this case and Becky? Well, that's one thing that's mentioned. Smoking pot, weed, marijuana, whatever you want to call it. Yes, Becky likes smoking. It wasn't a habit as much as a necessity for Becky because in the medical field, it is used for medicinal purposes, and I'm sure she had somewhat of an understanding of the benefits that it had opposed to things like prescription pain meds, for example. Even though I know that back then it was still illegal, and actually was surprised that it only recently became legal in 2021. March 31st in New York. Becky had injured her back so much so that she had to undergo a back surgery, not only leaving her with scars on her lower back, but with dependency on OxyContin, and she did not want that becoming more of a problem than a solution to her ongoing pain, so she turned to marijuana for help. It was a much safer alternative to Oxy without such addicting properties. I don't pass judgment on individuals that I don't know personally and their choices. Instead, I rely on those closest to the person, their descriptions and their perceptions. Those are the ones I count on to understand who someone like Becky was. She wasn't a reckless drug addict, for example, but she dabbled. She was actually very responsible. She held down jobs, and she had just transitioned from working in the hospital as a nursing assistant to home health aide. Becky was determined to find a job where she could make more of a difference in someone's life. She helped the elderly and autistic individuals, as well as people described by her mom as having developmental disabilities. She wanted to help others live their best lives. That was very fulfilling to her, and she would treat them like they were her own family. She was very dedicated, and for example, in 2009, her current position was part-time in-home caregiver for a developmentally disabled 16-year-old that struggled with everyday tasks. Becky would get up bright and early in the morning before 6 a.m. so that she could arrive at this boy's house with enough time to help ensure he was prepared for school. She would help him get dressed, feed him breakfast, then get him on the bus and then off the bus after school was over every day. She truly loved him, but as fulfilling as it was, her job also came with difficulties. So after work, she liked to let loose like many of us do. Everyone needs something to escape. Becky loved music, friends, and going out. Years ago, Nicole had introduced her to a friend named Jason. He ended up becoming Nicole's brother-in-law years later, but Jason merged into part of their very close friend group to become a best friend of Becky's. He remembers the impression Becky left on him when they were introduced. He didn't know that such a genuine person like her existed. She had the biggest smile. He said it would reach past her ears. Well, Jason ended up getting a roommate named Dan Mayer, who was 28 years old. In the fall of 2009, Dan started to accompany Jason when all of them went out, and eventually Dan met Becky. He was infatuated right away. Everyone could tell he really liked her, and soon, by October of that year, they were getting to know each other, hanging out more and more. He would pick her up from work. Then they would go grab a drink or a bite to eat, go to a movie, or just hang out with friends back at Jason's place. Soon, Becky confided in her mom that she and Dan were a thing, but it wasn't very serious. They were just starting to get to know one another. Fast forward to December of the same year. So just a couple months later, it's Thursday, December 3rd. Becky's mom worked the night shift at the hospital the night before from 7:45 p.m. until 8:15 in the morning. And she had another night shift that night, so she slept in until about 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon. Barbara did her normal everyday routine. Then later in the evening, when she was making dinner and getting ready for work, Becky and Damien were laughing and joking around as Becky was hovering over her brother, trying to steal some of his french fries. Well, Barbara said to Becky, "What are your plans for tonight?" And Becky told her that her and Nicole were going down to Kelly's Ale House for some drinks, and then they were going to meet up with Dan and some friends, and she should be home later because she had to work early the next morning. So she needed to be at work at 6 a.m. Barbara was like, "Okay, just text me when you get home." Becky said she would, like she always did. Becky knew that Barbara worried about her. Even though she was 24, she kept in constant contact with her mother throughout the day. Whenever she ventured out to a bar or went anywhere in town with a friend, she texted her mom to let her know she arrived home safely. No matter what she was doing, Becky made sure that she was always in communication with someone. Whether it was a call, a text, a MySpace message, she always had her phone on her like most of us do. It was basically glued to her. So it was easy for her to answer right away, and she would. That night, Barbara was very busy with her rounds at the hospital, but around 3:30 in the morning, she's on break and she has time to check her phone. She sees a text come in from Becky around the same time that said she was home and going to bed and that "I love you." Barbara responded with "Sleep well. You have to be at work in a couple hours." And she said, "I love you." Nothing out of the ordinary. But a few hours later, Becky's stepdad Larry is at home. He's getting ready for work that morning, and he gets a call around 6 a.m. It's from Becky's boss. Apparently, Becky had not shown up at her patient's house at her normal time, and they wanted to know if she overslept and was coming in. Larry was already rushing. He could hear her alarm going off at 6:20 in the morning. He's leaving, and he checks the driveway, and he sees Becky's car still outside, so he's calling her name. He's like, "Becky," thinking that she would hear him and get up. Barbara is still at work for another couple hours, and he's got to rush to work, and he'll be there all day. So he quickly texts Barbara to let her know what's going on. The text read, "Becky's boss called the house. She didn't show up for work. I'm late for work and racing out the door. Will you call her?" Well, when Barbara sees this message, her first feeling is of anger. She told Becky that "you better get some sleep because you had to work early in the morning." And it wasn't like Becky just not show up like this. The family that hired Becky counted on her. So Barbara was very disappointed, and I think that's understandable. So she immediately calls Becky, and it rings and rings. It rings 6 times, and then it goes to voicemail. Barbara's not happy. Becky always answered her calls, so when she hears that voicemail kick in, she goes off. It was a pretty heated message, and in no uncertain terms, she let her know that her job is her responsibility, that she needs to get to work now. And as a mom, I know that feeling. I know those heated messages. I got so many of them when I was growing up as well. Barbara expected to hear back from Becky pretty quickly, as it was typical for her to respond back right away, especially when it was her mother. But after about 10 or 15 minutes and not getting a call or even a text back, acknowledging that Becky got her message, Barbara calls Becky again. This time her phone seems to be turned off, or she's purposely ignoring Barbara's call because it goes straight to voicemail. Now, some people may not be alarmed, but Barbara was. She knew right away something wasn't right. She told herself, this is not the way that Becky operates. Something's off. So she goes back to texting, thinking that maybe Becky did go to work and now she's busy. So maybe she can't call her back. It's still unlike Becky, and she's trying to come up with reasonable explanations for her not reaching back out. She's saying things like, "Hello, did you get my text? Did you get my call? Where are you? Get up, wake up. Why aren't you answering?" And they were getting a little more aggressive over time. And over the next hour and a half or so, Barbara sent a number of messages. At some point, she was even kind of yelling at Becky. kind of reprimanding her for not being responsible. Barbara and Becky's former coworkers from the hospital, they knew that she never missed one day of work. And even if she was running late, she would let someone know. She cared so much about her patients, she would never just leave them hanging like that. At 8:15 in the morning, that Friday, December 4th, Barbara is finally leaving work. At this point, Becky would have been 2 hours late for her job. And still, there's no word from her. So Barbara is trying to get back to the house as fast as she can so that she can wake up her daughter and hopefully salvage her job. And as she's driving, she is filled with mixed emotions. She's worked all night, she's worried, she's disappointed, but she's also scared. And when she pulls up in that driveway and she sees Becky's car, her emotions went straight back to anger. She figured, you know what? Becky partied too hard the night before. Her phone died, she overslept, and she was racing inside on a mission at this point. Definitely upset. She runs right into Becky's room, opens the door, and she's not inside. So Barbara's trying to figure out what is going on. She sees Becky's purse in her room. She doesn't leave her purse. Most of us know that our purse contains our lives. We don't go far without it. So Barbara was worried. She doesn't see Becky's phone, and she's nowhere in the house. She knew that Becky was supposed to be with Nicole the night before, so she calls Nicole, letting her know her daughter didn't show up for work, and she wants to know if Nicole knows what's going on. Nicole says no. She has no idea where Becky would be because she went home earlier than Becky. Last she saw her, she was at Kelly's Ale House around 1:30 in the morning, and Nicole was heading out. Becky wasn't ready to leave. She told her she was going to get a ride from Dan, who had met up with them with friends. Nicole tells Barbara to maybe call Dan and check with him. Maybe she crashed over there the night before and her phone died. Barbara doesn't really know Dan that well, but she decides to check with him anyway to see if there's some reason that he decided not to drive Becky back home, and maybe she was still over there with him. So she calls him. Dan's like, Becky's not at my place. He says, I dropped her off at home around 3:15, 3:30, and he said he even made sure to walk her inside up to the door and everything. Barbara feels like Dan may be trying to cover for Becky, maybe because of how angry Barbara had been in those messages that she left and the text messages. So she says, Dan, please don't lie to me. I'm not mad at her. I just want to make sure she's okay. But Dan swears Becky is not at his place. So Barbara goes into panic mode. Nicole, Becky's best friend, and Dan, her new boyfriend, the two people that should be the closest to her, especially the night before when they were all hanging out, are unaware of her whereabouts. Barbara tells Larry maybe to call Nicole and Dan himself to see if he could get a different response. Maybe hearing from the dad, being more stern or something, they would tell him. Meanwhile, Barbara's calling everyone else she knows her daughter is close with. Coworkers, friends, family, her cousins, everyone. It's not long before all Becky's close friends are made aware of the situation, and none of them have any information about where she could be. It's concerning to them. They know how much respect Becky has for her mother. She would never leave her like this without telling her where she was. And of course, they're trying to come up with the most logical scenarios. Like, okay, maybe her phone died. She has no way to call them back, let them know where she's at. But why was her car at home? How would she have gotten around? Dan was the one that said he dropped her off at 3:30. That's around the time she texted her mom to let her know she was at home. So Larry calls Barbara back and says, you know what? Nicole and Dan both say that they don't know where she is. They were together at Kelly's Ale House. Then Nicole left around 1:30. And then the other group of friends went to Butcher Boys. It's a bar and grill, and they went there for the rest of the night. Then Dan took Becky and two other girls home, dropping Becky off first around 3:30 in the morning. He walked her to her door and left. Neither one of them has heard from Becky or seen her since then. Well, at this point, Barbara wants to see for herself, so she gets Dan's address and she takes a drive over there, hoping that Dan is, like I said, covering for Becky and that she's just scared that Barbara's really, really upset. She's hiding out until it blows over. Remember that this is also the house of Becky's close friend, Jason. He lives with Dan. Barbara shows up and again asks Dan if Becky was inside because she's desperate for answers. And he's adamant. He tells her, no, Becky's not at my place. She begged Dan to please let her know if she hears anything from her daughter. She's exhausted. She's feeling defeated. She's been working for hours and would usually go to sleep at this point, but she can't sleep. She can't think. She just keeps calling and texting Becky. She would text things like, Becky, please call home. We're so worried about you. I love you so much. Please call home immediately. Are you okay? Do you need us to come get you? The text just went on. And I can only imagine how this would feel because as a mom, if I was in this situation, my mind would be going crazy. Everyone's concerned. They're constantly checking in with Barbara, who is now waiting for Larry to get off work so that he can help her figure out what is going on. Hours go by, and at this point, Becky's friends are trying to call people, check social media, trying to see if they could locate Becky, and still nothing. Several of Becky's friends, Nicole, Lindsay, her uncle Khalid, and many others made their way over to Barbara's, just sitting in the living room with their phones and their laptops, trying to do whatever they could to help. Barbara called out of work that night. She couldn't function. She had to find her daughter. She was so tired, but she was keeping herself awake. She would only fall asleep when she was so exhausted that she couldn't fight it anymore. By the time Larry was off work that evening and gets back at home, it's around 7:30 p.m., and Becky's friends had now camped out on her parents' living room floor. They had blankets and food, and they had managed to log into some type of phone location app on their computer. It had the capability to provide a general vicinity of where Becky's phone was as long as it was on and within an area of the cell tower. So you could ping it, so to speak, and get the location. I don't think it was Find My iPhone. I don't think it existed back then, but it was something similar. And they're just waiting and waiting to see if it would light up so they could drive to that location that it pinged from. It is an ice cold winter in Long Island in December. The weather's brutal. The temperatures drop down to like the 20s, and that's -5 Celsius. It's snowy, it's icy, it's just unbearable to be outside for an extended period of time. And Barbara is really starting to think about that. She doesn't want to imagine her daughter out there in the cold, all alone somewhere. Larry decides it's time to call the local police department in Suffolk County to notify them about Becky's disappearance. He explained that she would never remain out of touch this long. She never had. It wasn't like her. She wouldn't just leave her loved ones worried like this. She also didn't do things like drink excessively either. And anytime she wasn't feeling well, she would let you know. Even if she did miss work on purpose, she would be up by now, doing things by now, running errands, eating, being in her room, talking to her friends, going on social media, something. It had been all day with no word and no activity. No one close to her had heard anything. Something wasn't right. It had been 16 hours since she was last seen. They send an officer out to Larry and Barbara's house to take a report. They ask them the basics about Rebecca, who she was, her age, when she was seen last with who. They tell them everything that I've already told you. But of course, in a lot more detail. Barbara says Becky has never disappeared like this before. And Larry added that there isn't a day that goes by that she wouldn't call. Even if she had a disagreement, she would call her friends. That phone was stuck to her ear. She wouldn't leave her purse behind like that either. So what was the urgency? Even her wallet and ID were still there. And that's when her parents explain that Dan, who was Becky's new boyfriend, was the one that was last seen with her. She didn't know him very well. He seemed nice enough, but it wasn't a very serious relationship, and Becky had confided in her mom that they had their little issues here and there. And as they are in the middle of this conversation, guess who shows up? Dan. He's there to help. He's wanting to look for Becky, track her down, and he seems concerned, but also angry. As everyone's providing information, Dan starts to question Barbara about whether Becky had another man in her life. She's like, "Really? That's your concern right now?" She said, "No, she doesn't." Dan responded by saying, "Are you sure?" And she was like, "Wow. Yes, I'm sure. And this is really not the time to be self-centered, accusing her of doing something with someone else, because we can't even find her." Barbara did not like the way that Dan was coming off. She thought it was odd. Then in the middle of them trying to locate her daughter, he's worried about her cheating on him. But maybe it was because he was trying to think of alternative places she could be. Dan's behavior raises suspicions with Barbara. After the report was put in, there wasn't much else for them to do but wait. And it was really hard on Barbara. Fear was setting in. She was breaking down in tears. She just wanted to hear Becky's voice again. She wanted to see her face, to know she was okay. And she was constantly texting her, "Please, please call me." I was shocked to find out that over 200,000 women go missing every year in Suffolk County and Long Island. That's so many. And 19 hours had gone by. It's close to 9 p.m. and the group is still trying to ping her phone. Every 15 minutes, Larry is doing it so that they can contact her. Larry also calls the officer back from Suffolk County PD and provides him with the login information to access Becky's cell phone. They have a family plan, so they're able to get in and see her call log. He also explains that they're keeping tabs on her location through a phone locator app and will update the police with any new information. And sure enough, They see her phone. It is actually moving, and it's an exhilarating feeling because in that moment, it had just come up for a minute and then it would be gone. And then it would come up and then it would be gone. It wasn't steadily tracking her location. It was like disappearing as if the phone was being turned on and off and on and off. They were trying not to even blink so they could pinpoint where it was. And they were just sitting there diligently making notes of every location that it would flash at. They were hoping that the police could use this information to narrow down a search or to tell other police departments to be on the lookout in that area. There was nothing concrete because the app would light up in an area, but it wouldn't stay lit up for long. So they weren't confident that Becky would still be there. Even though this app gives a radius of about 1 mile from where the pinpointed ping is. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, they do get a strong signal though. The app is showing that Becky's about 12 miles west, and it is steadily blinking, not moving. It's about a 20-minute drive, but it's close enough to where they decide to all get in their vehicles and race over there. Her friends are trying to think of anyone they know in that area. Why would Becky be there? They had no idea, but along the way, they're screaming her name out the windows. They're again scanning the streets, keeping their eyes open for any signs of her. They get closer to the area where her phone pinged and they're driving slower. They're looking around and they realize it's an industrial area. There aren't a lot of houses. It's in the middle of the night, so nothing's open. And they're confused, but they get out. And they look around. They even knock on businesses' doors. They're desperate to find out if anyone knows where Becky is. And there was no one. They had no choice but to go back to Larry and Barbara's house and wait. The next morning, it's Saturday, December 6th. The group decided to create missing persons flyers. They go have a bunch of them printed, hundreds, so they could go door to door, starting in Becky's neighborhood, and then expand outward everywhere, just so they could ask people if they had seen her. They were taping these flyers up everywhere. They lived in a pretty tight-knit community. Becky had grown up there, so many people came together to help find her. Here's what the flyers looked like. It says, "Have you seen Becky?" It has her name on it, Rebecca Koster, answers to Becky. She's 24, 5 feet 5 inches tall, 112 pounds. Her birthday is June 12th, 1985. She has dark brown eyes, dark brown straight hair to the middle of her back, and she'd been missing since 3:30 in the morning on December 4th. As far as clothing that she'd been wearing the last time anyone saw her, she had on a black puffy Rockaware brand zip-up jacket with pink lining, black boots with gray fur on them, and light blue jeans. They also list identifying characteristics. She had butterfly tattoos. One was a large lower back tattoo where she had that surgical scar from her back injury. The other tattoo was a smaller one on the right outer side of her ankle. She had her acrylic nails done with a French manicure and designs on both of the ring fingers, and a tiny nose ring stud in the right side of her nose. She also had a cartilage ear piercing that had a bar that goes to the top. You can see it right here. Oh, and she had the tongue pierced. Everyone went all over in different areas and passed these flyers out. Larry passed out at least 180 flyers. He was showing Becky's picture to as many people as he could. They went door to door in the neighborhood, and no one had any clues for them. Barbara started to lean more and more into thinking that Dan may know more than he's saying. Barbara didn't want to say anything about it yet, but she was beginning to ask all of Becky's friends what they thought about him. Jason was his roommate. He knew him very well, and he said, "You know what? Dan loves Becky. They seem happy together. They have a great relationship as far as he can tell." He didn't think anything could have happened between Dan and Becky that would cause her to go missing. He'd never seen Dan give off any clues that he would hurt Becky. But they know that people can snap. Sometimes the least likely person is responsible. But as more friends gave their opinions, it was revealed that Dan was definitely a lot more interested in Becky than she was in him. So they started to wonder if something happened at the bar to cause him to be jealous. And then that led to something worse. Something that put Becky in danger. This is all they had to go on. Everyone else checked out. He was the new guy. Friends were really coming down on him. They were asking him a bunch of questions and not really accepting his answers, even though he hadn't changed his story from the first time that Barbara reached out. I don't blame them for being laser focused on Dan. He was the last known person to have admitted seeing her. But there were 2 other witnesses in his car. And even Dan's sister. She told them Dan dropped Becky off, and they haven't seen her since. At this point, he's getting frustrated by all the attention being put on him. Larry even went to his door. He's asking what happened to Becky, saying things like, "We think you know more than you're saying." And he just broke down. He started to cry. He said, "I love Becky and I would never do anything to hurt her." He felt attacked, but he was still helping the search. He, Jason, and some of their other friends, they went out to Butcher Boys, that bar and grill where they were all hanging out before Dan took Becky home. They spoke to the bartenders and the managers and even patrons that were there, and no one knew anything or had any information about Becky. By now, Barbara had relayed her suspicions about Dan to everyone helping them search. She thought that he might have Becky hidden somewhere. There were people involved in this search that were like armchair detectives, but more like neighborhood watch, because they were keeping track of Dan's every move. There were people parked on his street, basically doing their own surveillance on him. While this didn't go over well with Dan, he was not okay of being accused of harming Becky or lying about where she was. He felt like everyone was against him. And despite this, his own roommate Jason felt certain Dan was not responsible. However, Becky's family didn't see it that way. They felt Dan had more information and he wasn't letting onto it since he was the last person to have seen her. They let police know what they believe that he has something to do with her disappearance. And the police always tried to build out a timeline. Starting in the days leading up to a person's disappearance, they need him. They need every detail he knows because many times the last person to see someone is the person who made them disappear. Well, they are about to get an even bigger reason to look into Dan. Barbara can't sleep. It feels like the hours are going by so slowly, all the thoughts that are going through her mind. It's been over 24 hours since her daughter has been seen. All she wanted to do was make sure she was safe. But the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The next day, on Sunday, December 6th, Barbara goes to find comfort at the home of her sister Elaine's house. They tried to have a normal visit. They were wrapping presents together and talking about what could have happened to Becky. They even had some friends go to a psychic who told them, you know what, Becky's fine. She's going to come home. She's alive, but she's in a dark place. Don't worry. They're going to find her. It was hard not to think about the possibility that Becky wasn't just missing, but that something worse had happened to her. Barbara was having a very hard time not breaking down. She stays over Elaine's into the later end of the night, and at 11:40, she looks at her phone screen when it lights up, and she is shocked. She just received a message from Becky. There are so many emotions rushing through her. What it said was very concerning. The text read, "Mom, Dan has me tied up in the basement. He doesn't know I have my phone. I'm not sure where I'm at. Please help." Barbara doesn't hesitate. She calls Becky right back, and she doesn't answer. So she's sending a text to Becky saying, "Call 911. They will find you." Barbara was frantic. She didn't know what to do, but at least there was hope. It was running through her. She was mixed with fear and confusion and the feeling of, I knew it. Her beliefs were confirmed. Dan had her daughter and she was in danger. She couldn't help but feel overwhelmed, knowing that the first person that Becky reached out to was her mom. She knows that when a child is in need, they usually call out to their mother. But at the same time, she wished she had just taken that moment to call 911. And maybe she had, but not knowing was driving Barbara crazy. Filled with adrenaline, she calls the officers on her daughter's case and she lets them know what happened, that Becky is being held captive by Dan Mayer. And she alerts everyone that's helping them with the search, and they're like, oh my God, she's alive. We've got to find her. And they're on a rescue mission. Barbara races back home, and she and Larry jump back on the computer with all of Becky's friends standing right next to them, and they ping her phone on that locator app. But it won't stay active long enough to register a location. So they say, forget it. Let's just race over to Dan's. That's where the cops were headed. I mean, obviously she said Dan was the one holding her hostage. It makes sense. They waste no time and they get over there. They need to hurry. They know he's got their daughter and they don't want to tip him off because that might risk him taking her somewhere else or worse. Before Barbara, Larry, and the herd of her concerned friends and family get to Dan's house, the cops are already there. They're inside questioning him. The police came ready. They weren't taking any chances due to the nature of Becky's text messages. They also had probable cause to do a full search of those premises, and that's what they do. Every room was thoroughly searched. Unfortunately, it turned up nothing, and Becky's family had trouble accepting this fact. To further investigate, the detectives knocked on every door in that vicinity, all around the neighborhood, to see if they could find any evidence of Becky's whereabouts, but they found nothing. No one had heard or seen anything. Jason is sitting there perplexed as to why they would send people and the cops over to his place. He lives with Dan, and he's a close friend of Becky's. He's frustrated, saying, if she was in my house, I would know. She's not here. She hasn't been here. He's like, wow, I could have told you that she wasn't here. If she was tied up, I'd know. There's no way. No way. Almost like this was unnecessary. But everyone looks suspicious at this point when they don't have any leads. The officers bring Dan down to the station, and since this case has escalated into more of an endangered persons investigation, Philip Frendo from Suffolk County, he's a detective, he's assisting. He sits down with Dan to ask him everything he knows about Becky. Dan's demeanor at this point is a mixture of frustration, confusion, anger, and concern. He explains he met up with Nicole, Becky, a group of their friends at Kelly's Ale House. At some point, Nicole goes home. Everyone moves from Kelly's Ale House to Butcher Boys. And then they hung out, drank, played pool. Everything was normal. When closing time came, Becky, along with 2 other women, got into Dan's car and he dropped Becky off first around 3:30. He says those women can corroborate everything I'm telling you. And he tells Frendo, I did nothing wrong. I love her. I would never hurt Becky. So then they ask, was she intoxicated when you dropped her off? And he's like, well, yeah, I mean, she'd been drinking. She was a little wobbly. I had to hold her up when I was bringing her to the door. But it's not like she couldn't get in her own door and unlock it and go inside. She wasn't falling down drunk. And they're like, are you sure she made it inside? And he's like, yes. I watched her go inside and close the door behind her. Dan is cooperative. Detective Frendo asks him if he's willing to take a polygraph just so that they can clear his name. And most of you know, polygraph results are not admissible in court. They're a detection device. They use them to probe for information. Maybe someone's hiding something. And using this, they can press them even further. Dan agrees. He'll take the polygraph. And they focus it on whether Dan had any knowledge of Becky's disappearance or her whereabouts. Well, it turns out the result shows deception. Even though they're not reliable, this result keeps Dan under the microscope. They sat there interviewing him for another couple hours. But they did reach out and they were able to confirm with those 2 other women that Dan drove her home and they saw Becky go into that house. Jason could corroborate that fact as well, that Becky had not been at their place. And Dan has an alibi for when Becky went missing and for when those texts were sent. He wasn't in a basement holding Becky captive. So Dan is cleared for now. But that doesn't mean much when it comes to Becky's family and friends. Jamie knew that Becky wouldn't lie about being tied up, and she would know if it was Dan. Unless, I don't know, he had her blindfolded or something. Or maybe someone was trying to make it look like they were Dan. And even if the police couldn't prove Dan did something to Becky, there was no way she would lie to her mother. Something wasn't right. People wanted Dan arrested. He was having a nervous breakdown, pleading to Jason, what do I do to make people believe I didn't do anything wrong? Meanwhile, detectives are interviewing Nicole and all of Becky's other friends that were with her on December 3rd into the early morning hours of December 4th. They're building out their timeline. Nicole lets them know that the night actually started at Becky's house. They had bought some weed earlier that day, and she explained that Becky had a back injury and relied on smoking weed every day to deal with ongoing pain. That night, they were in Becky's garage smoking and drinking. Then they headed out to Kelly's Ale House. And Nicole, like everyone has already said, goes home around 1:30 in the morning. Nicole says, Becky came outside, she grabbed a cigarette and her jacket out of my car, and I have not seen her since. Well, that's more information than they had before. It doesn't really add much help to their search, but every piece of this timeline is important. And word about Becky's disappearance spread quickly. The local news stations were all over this case now. They were going live from all the different locations Becky had been seen last, as well as gathering right in front of Dan's house and Barbara and Larry's house, asking the public for help and to contact the authorities with any information they may have. Her family hoped that the coverage from the media would bring in new leads. Her loved ones even spoke to multiple reporters, sharing their stories and hoping that this information would lead to Becky being found. They were pleading for help, and they were praying for Becky's safe return. Barbara just clung to her phone. She refused to put it down. She was hoping Becky would text her again. It was her lifeline to her daughter. It's all she had to hold on to. She was desperate for even the tiniest bit of hope that they would find her. She said that every time she heard that text tone from her phone, it was like her heart would stop. She was just clinging to it, watching and waiting. And then around 3 hours after that first text from Becky came in, she manages to be able to text her mom again. Wow, can you even imagine? Barbara can hardly handle it. And this text is worse. It read, quote, "My phone is about to die and my mouth is taped. I can't talk. I think this is Comac. Don't tell Dan about my text or he will kill me." End quote. Comac is a part of town. It's not where Dan's house is located. It's about 30 minutes west of Becky's. Barbara is beside herself. Becky just texted that her life is in danger. She is in immediate harm and they don't know how to find her. Barbara alerts the detectives and then she and all of her family and Becky's friends head over to Comac to search for her. They did what they had before in other locations. They drove up and down the streets just yelling her name. They had no idea where in Comac Becky would be. They were knocking on people's doors. They were screaming her name just in case she heard them and she could alert them to where she was being held. This is intense. But again, the search was in vain. There's no sign of her. So they have to go home and wait. They are back on the computer, and wouldn't you know it, Becky's phone is pinging again. This time, it's off Northern State Parkway. It's on the other side of the island, but they don't care. They don't care how far they have to drive. They're going to find Becky. And this is all too much. They don't have the resources that the detectives do. And they're giving them all this information every single time a new location pings. The cops go out there and look. However, this time it was a little more precise. It was a florist, but that didn't make any sense. It was closed. It was so late at night. No one wants to be negative about Becky's text because it's all they have to hold on to, but they do begin to question things. Like, if she was tied up, how was she even getting to her phone to text? Her friends are trying to make sense of it. Like, could it be in her back pocket? And then her hands are tied together behind her and she's able to kind of like slip it out and then look behind her, kind of turn her head back and text. They don't know, but they're trying to stay positive. But some people, like Jason and Jamie, they questioned whether it was really Becky texting her mom or if it was someone else. Why wouldn't she call 911? She's an intelligent, street smart woman. Why waste your time texting your mom at all? Just go get help. But they don't know the circumstances. Maybe she didn't have really good service. Maybe it was spotty and only text could go through and she knew her family would contact the police. I would be thinking all of those same things, just running scenarios in my head. Becky's family was becoming increasingly concerned as the days went by without her being located at Dan's house and still getting texts implicating him. They told detectives what they thought was that the messages didn't sound like Becky. The perfect spelling, that was suspicious. Like, if you were distressed, would you add correct punctuation? No, it wasn't adding up. There were definitely red flags going up. And though Dan had been cleared, he wasn't making it easy on himself after all the accusations and another text saying that he's holding her hostage because he does something very alarming. He goes on Facebook and he changes his name to Dan the Killer. Why would he do that? Well, his friends assumed it's because he's lashing out. He's fed up. He's being accused of being a killer. Instead, and Jason's insisting, someone's playing a trick on them. And they don't understand why they would want to frame Dan for this. Becky wouldn't do this. Detectives decide to pay a visit to Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill, where she was last seen right before she disappeared. They were eager to examine any CCTV footage that might be available before it's too late. They were hoping it would lead them in the right direction. Would it show Becky and Dan getting into an argument? Was there anything suspicious going on regarding staff or other patrons that interacted with Becky? Well, the footage shows different areas of the place. Here's the actual footage. You can see back of the restaurant, the pool table, the bar area, and detectives saw Becky and Dan and her friends, and also several men approaching Becky throughout the night. The detectives wonder if one of them may have something to do with her disappearance. Nicole had mentioned that Becky was very trusting to a fault, and because she was so beautiful, she received a lot of unwanted attention. But she didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. She would try to be nice, even when guys were being pushy. Detectives noticed that anytime Dan would leave Becky's side, men would walk right up to her and start talking. She would chat for a minute and then turn away and talk to her friends again, or Dan would walk back up. This went on all night. I mean, sure, that's not uncommon. It's a public place, especially a bar. Lots of singles. They're there to meet people, and Becky is gorgeous. She's not married, wearing a ring. Guys would hit on her. How would they know she was taken? Until, of course, they spoke to her. Her friends were familiar with this song and dance. Becky would smile, she would be pleasant, she would tell them I have a boyfriend, and then they would go back to just enjoying their night. Detectives show this footage to Barbara and Larry. At one point, Becky is captured on the security video, standing by a jukebox at 3:20 in the morning with Dan beside her. Larry said that Becky looked like she wanted to get out of that bar. You could see her body language, and it looked as though she kept saying, "I want to go home." Larry's like, "You can see her. She's sitting there waiting to get out of there." While Dan and his friends are on the other side of the bar, just still hanging out. While this investigation into Becky's disappearance continued, the detectives start to try to identify these men that were seen on the bar CCTV footage. They do realize it was late, Becky had to work, and that's probably why she wanted to leave. But they also want to know if there was any other reason for her urgency about leaving. Did someone make her feel uncomfortable? Well, the CCTV footage, like so many other times, is grainy. They can't make out who these people are. So they're doing their best to work with the staff on getting receipts and other information that can lead them to the people who spoke to Becky that night. Detectives also ask her friends if anyone stood out to them, any men they encountered or that they saw Becky with. And they say, yeah. One guy followed Becky to the bar when she went to go grab a drink by herself. And they saw her sitting there with him and talking for a little while. Detectives show her friends the footage and they point the guy out. You can see him sitting right here, right next to Becky while she's waiting on her drink. The man appeared to be African American, well-dressed, well-groomed, and it seemed as though Becky and the man were just engaged in a normal conversation. But upon closer inspection, they see the light of a phone screen light up. It looked like Becky and this guy had exchanged numbers. Either that or Becky had let him use her phone because it looked like her phone passed between hers and his hands. They watch it again, over and over again. It's really bad quality. They can't really be sure exactly what was happening, but they want to see if they can identify this patron. But further, they want to take a look at Becky's phone records. So they request that information from her carrier and ask it to be rushed. This is about to take the investigation into a whole different direction. Meanwhile, over at Becky's, the investigation continued. Technicians were inside. They were now taking DNA samples from Becky's family, hair samples from brushes, collecting things like her toothbrushes, among other things like dental records. They would need those and Becky's DNA to compare it with evidence they find, including a body, should they locate one that matches Becky's description. This news filled her family with dread because it was starting to look like this investigation was pointing more and more towards a murder rather than a missing persons case. With every passing day, they felt their hope of finding Becky alive slipping away. Barbara wasn't getting any more text messages from her, so they were hoping that her phone records would reveal a clue. Investigators discovered that there was a series of phone calls and texts to and from Becky's phone that occurred after she returned home from the bar. This finding was particularly concerning because it suggested that Becky may have been in contact with someone once Dan witnessed her getting inside her house safely. He could be telling the truth, and it wasn't him who spoke to her last after all. This new evidence prompts detectives to look even deeper. They see that Becky called a number around 3:30 in the morning, which is around the time that she was dropped off. Detectives track down who the number belongs to, and it's a friend of hers, Anthony Castro. He's already been interviewed, and he's been cooperating with the investigation trying to find her. He told detectives that she called him asking to meet up for a bit after she came home from the bar that night, but he declined. He's looked into and he's ruled out as a suspect. Then they moved to the next number on her phone records. The next 3 calls are from a different number, one with a 617 area code, which is from the Boston area. The first call came in around 4 a.m. and Becky didn't pick up. Then another call came in at 4:10 a.m. and then another at 4:27 a.m. They provide this number to Becky's family, and no one knows who it is. Her friends don't have anyone in that area code in their phones, and they don't know anyone that Becky would know out in Boston. Investigators call the number, and no one picks up. So they attempt to request phone records for this number, but they're informed that it's associated with a prepaid cell phone. And unfortunately, due to the nature of that type of phone, it's harder for investigators to track down the owner's information. In order to obtain more in-depth information, the police actually have to get a court order. It's hard for police to track a burner phone. Just like in the Long Island serial killer case that's going on right now, he is said to have used a burner phone or a prepaid phone without real service. So you can stay anonymous and you can just throw it away after you're done with it. This is how investigators in the case of Rex Heuermann believes he was speaking with those sex workers that he is accused of possibly killing. But of course, we know people don't just use prepaid cell phones when they're criminals. I know I've had one before because I didn't have any credit to get a real phone like at AT&T and whatnot. So it's definitely an option, especially for someone who might be younger. They may opt to go with a prepaid phone until they learn to become more responsible. Well, after receiving the court-ordered information, they were able to get a hold of cell tower records to where this phone was pinging, but they could not locate any personal information about its owner. Anyone can buy them at local gas stations, convenience stores, Walmart. They also get all of Becky's cell tower information, and now they know that she was indeed at her house on Falcon Avenue at 3:30 in the morning, like Dan had said. She was still at that location when the calls from the Boston number come in. The location of the unknown caller was west of Becky's house. The first call lasted for 15 minutes, and while on this call, the pings from the unknown caller's phone were heading east towards where Becky was. The next call came in at 4:27 in the morning, and that call was only 20 seconds long. When they mapped the cell tower pings from both Becky and the unknown caller's phone, they're in the exact same place, Becky's house. Logically, investigators believe that whoever this was called Becky to see if she wanted to hang out. Police already know that she was looking to do something after returning home because her friend Anthony provided information about the content of the call she made to him at 3:30. So it stands to reason that the second call that came in right outside of Becky's was the unknown caller letting her know they arrived. That's why it's only 20 seconds. That's how long it would take to say, "I'm here," and for Becky to respond. Not too long after this, both phones are traveling in the same direction. They're headed to an area to the north called Port Jefferson Station. It's about 15 minutes away. Soon afterward, there's no activity coming from Becky's phone, except of course later when her family tries to obtain those pings on the computer. Cell phone tower pings are not precise. They give you a vicinity of where the person was located, so they have a lot of investigating to do at this point, but they are further along than they have been. Everyone's wondering, who is this person that Becky left with so late or so early in the morning when she had to be up for work at 6 a.m.? Clearly, they have to be the link to knowing what happened to her. So who were they? Well, once again, the investigation is going to take another turn, and it's not a good one. Devastating, actually. On Tuesday, December 8th, 4 days after Becky went missing, a nationwide alert is put out with all the pertinent information. Now even more media outlets are all over this case. A beautiful young girl goes missing after a night out, texting her mom that she's tied up. Of course it drew interest. The media was basically living on Barbara's front lawn, just waiting for the news to break. And it was about to. At the same time that all of this is happening in New York, there's another case that's gaining media attention 100 miles away in another state. It's a place called Stonington, Connecticut. It's about 3 hours away from Becky's, and it's very rural. There's only about 5,000 people that live in that area, maybe less. Interestingly, it's on what is referred to as Long Island Sound, which is that body of water between Long Island and Connecticut. I've heard of it before, but I never knew where it was or anything like how it was formed. See how it's a cutout? Well, that's because it was created when a glacier tore a hole in that land. We're talking 10,000, 15,000 years ago, but I found that fact to be worth mentioning. Unlike Long Island, though, Stonington is not built up. It has a lot of underdeveloped land, a lot of farms. You can see what it looks like on this map. Just a lot of nothing. Well, there was something. Back on Friday, December 4th, around 7:15 p.m., less than 24 hours after Becky went missing, a man named Russell Morrison was driving towards his home down a dark, winding country road called Jeremy Hill in North Stonington, Connecticut. He was coming up to Route 201, which is also known as Mystic Road. This area is definitely the back roads. It's quiet, dark, and sleepy. He saw something up ahead. It was on the left side of the road, and it was really bright, and it appeared to be a small brush fire. So he immediately calls 911, and as he gets up closer, he pulls over. Now, coincidentally, he just happened to be an assistant fire chief. The fire department was only 3 minutes away from this location, so Russell pulls over, relaying all this information, including his exact location, to the 911 operator. They alert the fire department, and they're out there within minutes. And as a matter of fact, by the time Russell was able to pull out his fire extinguisher from his truck, The fire department was already there. The fire wasn't raging. It actually looked like it had just been set minutes before Russell saw it. They didn't have to use a fire hose. The chief was on the scene, and he took a fire extinguisher and tried to combat the flames. As they were getting smaller and smaller, he realized that there appeared to be a body on fire. Now, I know in many cases, I hear it's never a mannequin, and I'm starting to think we need another saying, it's never a brush fire. Because of the chief's belief that it's a body, he began aiming the fire extinguisher upward instead of directly on the area. He did this to keep the chemicals from coming down aggressively. This was to preserve the evidence, and once the fire's out, they realize it's not just a fire, it's a human body on fire. State troopers are immediately notified because this finding indicates that this is a crime scene. How many times is this now that I've unknowingly started researching a case only to find out it consists of finding a body burning on the side of a road? It's understandable. This is a common way for someone to dispose of a body because fires are unforgiving. They destroy everything in their path. I can think of at least 3 recent cases involving fires. Celia Huda, she was the Florida Gators cheerleader, Andrea DeVesco, the college sorority girl, and the Frensley family. It's unreal. And it never gets easier to talk about these cases. Connecticut state troopers come out there, they block off the road, they designate it as a crime scene, they put up the yellow tape, and they begin searching for any evidence that they could find. It's for sure the remains of a human body, and as they're taking a closer look, documenting every detail of what they're seeing as soon as they get there, so that they can have the most accurate picture of the scene, they notice that the body is wrapped in a number of materials, layers of sheets, blankets, garbage bags, and then wrapped in duct tape, sort of like a mummy, very tightly around and around, so that everything just stuck together. And of course, all these materials are melted together from the fire. It's clear to the troopers that this is not where this person died. They were brought to this location to be disposed of like trash on the side of the road. It's heartless. Clearly, a person doesn't do this to themselves, so troopers call homicide investigators along with crime scene technicians to begin to collect evidence, take pictures, and prepare the body to be transported to the medical examiner's office. I want to show you some pictures of the scene from that night. This right here is the road that Russell was driving down. It's so dark that the troopers had to bring out a floodlight so that they could see what was going on. You can see one of those lights right here on the left side. That is where the remains were found. The yellow crime scene tape is up, along with cones blocking off the road. The state police van is there on the right. And in the middle, that's one of the troopers' squad cars. Now, the second picture is from a vantage point of that squad car, looking towards the opposite direction. And right here, this blurred out section is exactly where the fire was and, of course, where the body was found. And you can see what is most likely Russell's truck pulled over to the left. Here's a better look at that floodlight illuminating the area of interest. Look how close this is to the road. You can also see how empty this area is as far as evidence is concerned. Everything is in one concentrated area and only consists of the body and the material it was wrapped in. And lastly, here is a view from much closer, just to show you how close this was to the roadside. It's as though the person who disposed of this body just opened up their car door and threw them out. It's disgusting. No effort at all to hide anything, of course, except lighting it on fire and expecting it to be destroyed. But thankfully, these men were there in the nick of time. You can even see smoke emanating from this area in this picture. It's just so eerie. Sometimes I debate about even showing any pictures of the scene, but of course, I do my best to respectfully conceal anything too gruesome while balancing being as informative and detailed as possible. And you probably know how much I like to dig in and find out where these locations are and what they look like today. I was able to use those crime scene photos to pinpoint exactly where this was. Here's a picture of the location on Google Maps, and you can see here's the same sign on the right, the guardrails, the pole here on the left, and even this tiny pole at the end of the rail on the left side where they found the remains. I wondered why there were guardrails. Why did they need them here? And I looked over, and that's exactly why. Because there is water right here. It's interesting for me to look at this area so many years later. The remains were transported to the Connecticut State Medical Examiner, Dr. Ira Kampfer. He had 30 years of experience in his field and conducted over 4,000 autopsies. He would be carrying out the exam on this body the next morning on Saturday, December 5th. Let me explain his initial findings to you. He observed a partially burned body wrapped in layers, which he began to carefully and meticulously remove little by little. He wanted to preserve as much of them as possible for evidentiary purposes. This is a very difficult and tedious job with a lot of pressure to get things perfect because you only have one chance to determine who this person is, what happened to them, and who did it. Justice depends on it. No personal items were collected from the scene of the fire. However, canines, they did alert in that area that an accelerant had been used and they could smell the presence of gasoline. Now, every piece of evidence on the body is photographed and bagged and then sent to the police crime lab, and that's where analysts will examine it in detail. That's where they run all the DNA tests, they look for trace evidence, and I want to show you what these layers of material looked like at the scene so you can get a better understanding with what he was dealing with. This right here looks to be a thick blue blanket. It appears to have red stains on it that would be suspected blood at this point before being tested. And you can see that to the left, at the end of the blanket, there's a red tie on a black garbage bag. And beyond that, there's a strip of silver duct tape. As we move to the left, you can see more garbage bags as well as burnt debris, just ashes and destroyed materials. They really don't look like much, but they give you some perspective on what this doctor had to work through just to get down to the actual body so he could start his examination. Once he was able to remove all the outer wrappings, he gets a much better view of the deceased individual and he determines it's a young female. As far as ethnicity was concerned, from what he gathered from the skin that was still intact, she appeared to be of Asian descent, possibly Latina, or even a light complexion African American. Her hair was cut off, her nose was cut off, her fingers were removed, as well as all of her toes. Her ears had been taken off of her head, as well as chunks of skin. They had been excised, cut away, and it was left with deep gouges. One of those areas was on her right outer ankle. The skin was removed in a section. The front of the body was burned more than the back, but luckily, the fire had been put out fast enough to where only the outer layer of skin had been charred. So as Dr. Camphor carefully turned her over, he could tell that she had been placed face up before being lit on fire. Her back had not been burned. It remained in contact with the ground, and there was apparently a large section of skin that had been removed from the lower portion of her back. The areas that were mutilated and removed were ones that could have had identifying characteristics to them. For example, we know that fingerprints can be used to identify someone, therefore the killer removed them. They may have believed that toes could have toe prints, or the fingers and toes could have been painted in a certain way, and the killer wanted to remove them so that their loved ones wouldn't recognize the victim. The ears could contain earrings that are identifiable heirlooms passed down generation to generation. The nose could have a marking on it like a birthmark or a mole or even a nose ring. So the perpetrator in haste could choose to just cut these areas off the body instead of taking out every piercing. It makes sense. However, the killer must not have looked in the victim's mouth because he left two things behind: a tongue ring and all of her teeth. Teeth are as good as fingerprints as far as identifying someone is concerned, as long as they have dental records. Our teeth are naturally very unique, different shapes and sizes and positions, but also our dental work. That's a huge indicator that you have the right person identified. Fillings, dental implants, anything that shows up on an x-ray and has been documented can be matched to a victim. And even if the teeth are removed, if the jaw is still there, then they can use dental records. And in many of those cases, they can see evidence of dental work left behind. It's very interesting. But now for the internal exam and those findings. The doctor's job is twofold. He has to designate a cause and manner of death. Determining a cause of death is harder than the manner of death because the burns. And one thing he wants to know is whether this person was alive before the fire started. So he looks to the lungs to see if there's any soot present. And there isn't, which means that she did not inhale any smoke. Therefore, he determines that she was deceased before her body was set on fire. But because of the burns, external injuries are harder to locate, so you have to look at the organs on the inside, and Dr. Camphor locates a laceration on the liver, as well as 200 cc's of blood in the abdominal cavity, which at this point had started to clot. And there are also 4 sharp force injuries to her neck. It's not readily apparent whether or not they happened pre or post-mortem because of all the burning. But this wound to the liver is enough to determine that it was the cause of death, and the manner is determined to be homicide. Now, this begins a homicide investigation as soon as that doctor signs an autopsy report with the manner of death as homicide. A full-blown investigation is on. Since they don't know who this woman is, Connecticut detectives search through all of their current missing persons reports, but they don't find any that match her description. So they widen their search to other districts and surrounding areas and put out an alert with all the physical characteristics that they determined existed on their Jane Doe, including the fact that she had a tongue piercing. Well, detectives back in Suffolk County are checking all the reports like they do every day, and this alert of this Jane Doe stands out because of that tongue piercing. Becky had her tongue pierced. It's something that her and her friends did together. You can see them in this picture right here. I mentioned it was unique, pink, with a butterfly. Well, Jane Doe has the exact same one. It's not enough by itself to say this is Becky, but Suffolk County believes it is. They already have Becky's DNA and dental records, so they hand them over to Connecticut to confirm whether this is Becky or not. And it doesn't take long for them to make the heartbreaking confirmation that the body found on the side of the road was that of 24-year-old Rebecca Koster. That is so sad. Her family was holding out hope. They also realized that the descriptions of where Becky had tattoos and piercings correspond with all of those areas that had been excised and cut off of her body. Wow, I can't even imagine. But of course, I can, because I told you about each and every one. Clearly, this killer tore her apart. Her ears, they had distinctive earrings. That top left one with the bar, that's why he removed it. Her nose, cut off because she had a nose stud. Her hair removed because it was long and had a texture to it that someone could identify. And then her tattoos. To think how much time it took for this monster to cut her tattoos from her skin, it's unbelievable. It's horrifying to think of all this. It's December 9th. It's been 5 days since Becky had gone missing, and her friends and family are exhausted. They have been working nonstop trying to find her. Now, they had heard about the unidentified body found on the side of the road in Connecticut, but they never, not once, even thought to connect it to Becky. They were still looking for a missing person, not a dead person. And that day, after working as hard as they were, they wanted a break. They needed to get out of the house just to have some sense of normalcy. So the group of them head over to a restaurant to get a bite to eat, and this is the first time that they went out and did anything that wasn't related to finding Becky since she disappeared. They had just sat down and they ordered their food, and all of a sudden Larry gets a phone call. He hangs up and he tells everyone, "Stop what you're doing. We gotta go." It was Detective Friendo. They need them to come to the house because there has been a break in the case. They toss cash on the table and they rush to get back home. Their first thought was, oh my God, they found her. I mean, of course they were hoping for the best, for positive news. They were hoping they'd walk in and Becky would be standing there in the living room with her arms outstretched, and it would be a happy reunion. Well, Larry and Damien arrive home first, and the detectives are already there. He quickly unlocks the door and lets them in, and they don't wait. They don't wait for Barbara to arrive before delivering the heartbreaking news to Becky's stepdad and 15-year-old little brother. Not too long after this, Barbara and everyone else gets there. When she walked in and she looked at her husband's face, she knew it wasn't good, but she still wanted to hold on to hope. She turned to the detective and she said, "Is it bad news? Did you find her?" He told her to please take a seat, and she's like, "Don't say it. Don't say it." He looks at her and he says, "We found her, but I'm very sorry. She's been murdered." Barbara lost control. She grabbed her coat. She ran out into the cold. She went down her driveway and she screamed, "Someone murdered my baby. They killed my baby." She said it felt like half of her heart was ripped from her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't believe that Becky would never come back home again. She'd never see her face. She would never hug her. She would never hear her voice again. Now, we hear so many stories, and sometimes we don't sit with those feelings and those realizations. We forget that this is real. We don't take a minute and pause and imagine what this must feel like for this mother. It's a real family. They have spent 24 years raising their daughter, all of those years, putting hard work in, providing for her, teaching her, growing with her, watching her grow up, being in awe of how amazing she was, and having so much hope for her future. When something like this happens, it's not that your child dies, it's a piece of you that dies. Nicole was stunned when she heard the detective deliver the news about her best friend of 10 years. She didn't understand how this could have happened. Larry was numb. He didn't know what to feel. He had been in Becky's life a long time. How could someone do this to someone so special? He kept thinking how many hours he spent just the day before, 8 hours passing out 180 flyers. And he thought to himself, I can't go back to all those places and tell them to take them down because she's dead. Detective Frendo is a father himself. He has 2 kids. So he tells Becky's family that he promises he will find out who did this to her and make sure they get what they deserve. Then they all sit down with him so that he can explain exactly what they know so far and how poor Becky died, as well as how she was found and where. He explained everything that they knew from law enforcement in Stonington, Connecticut. They said that Becky's body was found less than 24 hours after she disappeared. And when Barbara heard this, she was disgusted. She realized there was no way that those text messages that she had received were from Becky. Her remains had already been discovered around the same time that Larry was calling to report her missing. Barbara cannot even begin to think about the fact that Becky's killer was the one not only just sending those messages, but giving them false hope, tormenting them. Her killer was reading all of her pleas, all of her heartfelt and desperate messages that she kept sending Becky. It was just too much to take in. Who would do such a thing? Well, the same type of person who did all of those other horrific things that the detectives relayed to this poor family. With each detail, Barbara felt sick. She used to warn Becky that she was a prime target. She'd say, "You're so beautiful. All these men are after you." But Becky just shrugged it off. She never thought anyone would do anything like this. This was her mother's worst nightmare. How could someone stab her in the liver, mutilate her, and then throw her away like trash? All she wanted to do was see Becky again. But she knew that wouldn't be possible. Not the way she was before. This wouldn't be Becky. Everything that made her her was gone. She couldn't comprehend the kind of evil person that could commit such an act. She said there are demons out there that look like people. When Larry heard the details, he was praying that she was already dead before the body was set on fire. He said this happened at 7:30. It's not like it was even dark. Someone had to have seen something, but it was pretty dark considering where this area was. There were no streetlights here. But I understand his point. They want answers. Once the news of Becky's murder was out, the media couldn't wait to speak with the family. Both Larry and Barbara went on camera. They were so brave. They sat in their home and they expressed their shock and their heartache and their disgust in the person who killed their daughter and continued to taunt them by sending them text messages from her phone. This is also something the Long Island serial killer did. He taunted at least one of the victim's family members. The calls are being made using the victim's phone. And in one of these calls, the caller admitted to killing and doing very perverse things to her body. Wow. And recently, those calls were traced to a location in Midtown Manhattan near where the man that's in custody right now, Rex, had an office. So similar, using the victim's phone and tricking their family. Well, in Becky's case, Barbara said she felt stupid for believing that it was her daughter sending these texts. But it was the only hope she had. It's what kept her going, and I felt so sorry for her. Don't feel stupid because you did everything right. You kept in contact with her, trying to trace her phone. The only person that should feel stupid and so many more things is the killer. How dare him pretend to give them hope? Barbara said on camera, addressing the killer, quote, "How would your mother feel if she got that message? We want closure. We just want to know who murdered our daughter and they should pay for it." End quote. News of this murder has everyone in the community scared that there is a killer on the loose. Detective Frendo is going back to the evidence that they have at this point, and he decides to ask everyone who was with Becky that night at Butcher Boys if they remember anyone that was acting suspicious. Well, Becky's friend Jennifer remembers something. There was a guy at the bar that no one knew, and he kept coming up and trying to work his way into their group, sitting next to them, trying to talk to women, make them feel uncomfortable, and he was very pushy and creepy, especially with all the questions he was asking. And then he grabbed Jennifer's phone, took it right out of her hand, and proceeded to put his number and his name inside as one of her contacts. Jennifer provides Detective Frendo with this information. His name is Jay Brown. And guess what? It's a 617 number, just like the one that called Becky that night. The last call that Becky answered before she was killed. They compare the two numbers. They're an exact match. They have Jennifer take a look at that CCTV footage, and sure enough, she identifies the man seen sitting right next to Becky that night as the same one who took her phone and was aggressively coming onto them. She recalled he's about 6 feet tall. He's African American. He was very nicely dressed, with a long sleeve sweater vest on. As they keep going through this footage, they examine the video around 2:30 a.m., and that is when they see Becky standing at the bar waiting for her drinks. And the man Jennifer has identified as this aggressive guy who took her phone and put his number in without her permission is sitting there talking to Becky. At first, it had looked like Becky had wanted to interact with this man and that she had exchanged numbers, but now it looked more like Becky was just trying to be nice to a man that was clearly being manipulative and forcefully taking her phone, and she was probably intimidated enough to give him her number so he would leave her alone. That's who Becky was. She was nice. She didn't want to hurt people's feelings. And honestly, who thinks that by simply giving a guy your number, it would lead to your murder? Well, many of us, because we hear stories like this, don't we? The video shows Becky having 2 or 3 drinks before this interaction even occurred. Intoxication is another element of this case that explains some of the things that I've seen in relation to victim blaming. I hope to dispel some of those rumors and assumptions about what really happened that night. I have to after what I saw, and I will get to that in a little while. But in order to get to that part, I have to get to who this Jay Brown guy is. This is about to get intense. Remember how the medical examiner took his time to remove every little piece of material that Becky had been wrapped in? Well, that was all sent to the lab. And they're looking at the duct tape, and they decide to try to pull fingerprints from it. Now, typically, they get prints from the outside part, the shiny part, not the sticky part. For a number of reasons, it's harder to work with. People usually press on, the non-sticky side. And of course, considering the tape was in a fire, they don't really expect to get anything from the sticky side. But they didn't find any on the outside of the tape, so they said, why not just give it a shot? Well, thankfully they did, because it was almost a miracle. They found 2 latent prints. They were a right and left thumbprint. The killer may have remembered to remove all of Becky's fingers, but he couldn't really do anything about his own. 2 thumbs up for this diligent forensics right here. This is a very rare find. So they run these prints through the database in Connecticut, and they don't get a hit. So they pass them on to Suffolk County. They run the prints through the New York system, and on December 11th, they get a hit. A 29-year-old man named Evans Ganthier. Now they have 2 names, this guy and Jay Brown, the person from the bar. Well, nothing comes up for Jay Brown, so they obtain background information on Evans Ganthier. He was born January 20th, 1980. He attended St. Anthony's High School in South Huntington on Long Island, graduated in 2007 from Dowling College in Oakdale, New York, where he earned a bachelor's degree in psychology. The address on his license was 38 Miller Avenue, Central Islip, New York, which is about 15 minutes from Becky's. But that place doesn't match where the phone traveled the night she disappeared. So they continue looking about how this man could be connected to her. When they ran his social security number, he was not listed as being employed anywhere. However, there were 2 business listings matching his name and the address of 38 Miller Avenue. One was called Secrets Adult Entertainment Services, which appeared to currently be active and in business. The other one was for a listing called Happy Time Entertainment. Interesting. When the police called the number on the listing for Happy Time, a woman answered. She said it used to be a kids' party business, but it was no longer in operation, and she had not spoken to Evans in a very long time. She wouldn't even give police her name. Clearly, she did not want to be associated with this man at all. It's already sounding very weird, just the combo alone, kids party and adult entertainment. That's quite a broad range of business ventures unless this creep was combining them, which is just gross. So moving on, this man had been arrested at least 5 times, 4 misdemeanors. He was convicted of 2 of them. and a couple of them were adjudicated cases, but he had one case pending because he failed to appear in court. If you're wondering what these charges were for, well, among other things, one was a domestic incident with an ex-girlfriend, and they included allegations that he was pimping her out and running a business that consisted of taking photographs of women in his garage in Port Jefferson Station. Now, that area was the location where Becky's phone and the unknown caller's phone traveled the night she went missing. Now they're onto something. It turns out the 38 Miller Avenue address was Evan's mother's house. When they give both of these names, Jay Brown and Evan Scanthier, to Becky's friends and family, they're at a loss. They have no idea who either one of these people are. Well, investigators let them know that Evan's thumbprints match the duct tape on Becky's body. Jennifer comes down to the station and she's shown a photo array that includes Evan's picture. And she's able to positively ID him as the man that took her phone from her. Jay Brown is Evan's alias. On December 14th, they issue a warrant for Evan Scanthier's arrest. Detectives had already been tracking his movements. They sent officers out to every location they could find that was connected to him. The vehicle that Evans had received some tickets on while driving was an SUV, and they looked at it and found the vehicle parked in front of his girlfriend's house in the Bronx. They waited outside until he came out that front door, and they immediately arrested him without incident. Becky's family was so happy that someone was in custody, but there were so many unanswered questions, like why he would do this. When Frendo interviewed Evans, telling him that they believe he was responsible for killing, dismembering, and setting Becky's body on fire after getting her number from Butcher Boys in the early morning hours of December 4th, of course, he denies knowing anything about her and said that he clearly remembers he didn't go out that night because it was his sister's birthday. He said he couldn't remember the last time that he was even at Butcher Boys. Do people think cameras don't exist? Frendo told Evans that there was a video of him at Butcher Boys talking with women early on December 4th. So then Evans said, oh yeah, I was there. I forgot. I have a bad memory. When they showed him a video of him actually talking to Becky, that's when he acknowledged meeting her that night. He said they exchanged numbers, but that was it. Frendo asked if Evans liked to go out to bars, and he said he did. And that quote, he's met a lot of girls the last few weeks. Girls, they would just get drunk, jump in his car, and he'd drive them home, end quote. Well, Frendo was like, through cell phone information, we're able to figure out that your phone was in the same location of Becky's house around 4:30, December 4th, with Becky's phone in the same location, and they both traveled towards your house in Port Jefferson Station. And that's when he changed his story again. It's like every time they present him with a new piece of evidence, the narrative changes. Now he's like, right, yes, I did meet her at her house, but it was never for sex or drugs or anything. We were just talking and hanging out. He even mentions that she said she couldn't hang out long because she had work in the morning. But he asked her if she wanted to come to his place for just a little while, and she agreed. He said they hung out for a bit, and then he brought her back home. He spent the next few days with his girlfriend. Evans insisted nothing happened and that they could search his house and his car, which he did give consent to, because he said, you're not going to find anything since I didn't hurt her. This went on for 2 hours, him just denying anything happened to Becky. What's important to point out is that there's always truth in between lies. So what was gathered here was that he specifically pointed out that he didn't want drugs or sex, two things that were most likely involved. Drugs to lure Becky since she enjoyed smoking and had been looking for a friend to meet up with before Evans stepped in that night. And sex, that's what he wanted and what Becky wasn't interested in giving him, and that is why she's dead. We will get more into what made Becky get into his car a little later, because that is where a lot of victim blaming has been placed on Becky. But back to the interview. When Frendo told him that his thumbprints were on the duct tape found on Becky's body, his story changed dramatically. Are you ready for this? He finally tells Frendo that he wouldn't believe him if he told him what really happened that night. And Frendo's like, try me. Evan said he asked Becky to come back to his house, and she agreed, and they were driving there. But all of a sudden, she began frothing at the mouth. She was having trouble breathing. She was gagging, and he began freaking out. He's got this girl with him. She's sick. She's having some kind of overdose or reaction to something. And he was close to his house at this point, so he figured, you know what? I'll grab her a cup of water. That'll help. But when he was getting her out of the car and he's walking her through his garage door, she wasn't steady enough to walk by herself. He said she was intoxicated. But more than that, it seemed like she was out of it. He insisted he was trying to get her inside to get that water. But as she's walking in his garage, she tripped over a set of 50-pound dumbbells on the floor. He mentioned that his girlfriend always trips on stuff too, like, I wish I would have just cleaned up around here. He said normally Becky would have probably braced herself and broken her fall, but instead, in whatever state she was in, she just slammed her head onto that hard concrete and she was knocked out. So he ran over to her. He didn't know what to do. She did not look conscious. She was still breathing though, but having trouble. So he put her in the back of his SUV and he's rushing to get to the nearest hospital. But she stopped breathing before they got there, and he realized that he had a criminal record and he was the last one with her. He panicked, and in his words, he said, quote, that it would look bad if a black man drove up to a hospital with a dead white girl, end quote. I could be mistaken, but I didn't know Becky was white. They never confirmed her ethnicity, but when looking at her mother and her uncle and other blood family members, I'd guess that she's biracial or multiracial, but I digress. Those were his words and his impression of Becky through his eyes. So he says, in a panic, he went home, and when he checked on her, she was not breathing. He's more panicked. He has a dead girl in his house. He couldn't keep her there. He didn't know what to do with her, and he didn't want anyone to think that he hurt her. So he needed to get rid of her, and definitely in a way that no one would be able to identify her. So in this panic state, he said he cut off her hair, fingertips, toes, nose, and carved out her 2 tattoos so no one would be able to identify her. And then he wrapped her in plastic and a photo backdrop that he had hanging in his garage. Then he put her in the back of his SUV and he drove to the port in Port Jefferson and took the ferry to Connecticut. Then he bought some duct tape and gloves and found a motel to stay in. At first, he told the investigators that he dismembered her in his garage, but then he changed his story and said, no, it was at this motel in Connecticut. Then afterward, he scattered her body parts all across southern Connecticut while he was driving around looking for a place to dispose of her. This is just evil. It's so disgusting. And he was so tired that he had to rest until it got dark. And then he found a spot in North Stonington where he dumped her body, poured gasoline on top, and then lit her and drove away. But he never killed her. Nope. It was just a huge accident. And he feels so awful that this happened to this poor girl. And he was playing the victim in all this. I kid you not. Because she had just been so messed up so bad that she tripped in his garage and died in his vehicle, leaving him looking like a killer. Wow, this is laughable. And of course, Frendo doesn't believe this for a minute, especially because he knows the cause of death was a stab wound to Becky's liver. But Evans probably thought that her body was so badly burned that they wouldn't even be able to tell the cause of death. Frendo didn't want to reveal that right now. He wanted Evans to keep lying. The next claim he made was that they can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed her, since he didn't. Okay, I just have to say this. If it was an accident, accidents happen. Let me tell you what you do. You do the normal thing. You call the police and you tell them, because it can be proven. And even if it's more up in the air and you have to prove it in a court, this, what he did, isn't something that someone does when they witness an accident. They don't desecrate a body. They don't hide a body. Instead, they try to get medical attention even if it fails. He plays the victim card. Oh, why did she have to die on me like this? At the same time this interview is going on, his house is being searched. And in the garage, there was sort of a photography area set up with a camera and lights. This was most likely where he conducted his adult entertainment business, taking photos of women. And as they continued to search, they found a paint roller, a scrub brush, a broom, cement cleaner, paint, and a paint tray. And they looked like they had just been used. they see a large portion of cement in the garage that had been cleaned and painted over in a big square. Just an area on the floor, painted. But there's nothing linking Becky to the garage. It's all circumstantial. Because he cleaned up and put all that paint over it, there was no DNA that they could get. Evans says this is just where, Becky fell and was gagging and frothing at the mouth. But the story gets even more wild. Evans said that when her phone started getting all those text messages from her family and her friends, he pretended to be Becky and say that she had been held captive by her boyfriend, Dan. From the context of her own messages, he was able to ascertain that her boyfriend was Dan, and she also told him that when talking to him at the bar. This is also not something that someone who witnessed an accident would do. They wouldn't try to throw off the case and try to pass blame. He told Friendo that he knows this looks bad, but, quote, his girl chasing days finally caught up with him, end quote. Wow. That's the description of what happened? His curse for chasing women, which remember he said, oh, no, it wasn't for sex. But this is his curse. His punishment for chasing women, that one accidentally dies on him. What do you even think of this? Evans explained that he scrubbed and he painted that garage floor after he returned from Connecticut, and then he left to be with his girlfriend. Now, for reference, I need to show you something to make sure this makes sense. He did not drive over 100 miles to Connecticut. When he said he drove his car to the port, he got on a ferry. His car went on the ferry. This is what it looks like. It takes you across the Long Island Sound. You drive onto it with your car, and it drops you off at the port in Connecticut. He thought he was smart. Okay, remember when I told you it was going to get even more wild? Well, Friendo's like, great story, bro. He didn't really say that, but pretty much he's like, interesting story. Except Becky died from a stab wound to her liver. Well, Evans gets all flustered. He says, no, that can't be possible. No. I have no reason to stab her. Why would I stab her? We were just hanging out. Friendo tells Evans that he knows something went wrong between him and Becky that led to him stabbing her. But Evans insisted that he didn't. He said, quote, if there were problems, I wouldn't need a knife. Friendo was like, well, I'm not sure about that because of what you did to Rebecca. And that's when Evans was yelling. He's like, that was only to hide her identity. I didn't kill her. He's not a knife person. Wow. A person who used a knife, even as it dulled, to continue to mutilate an innocent girl wants us to believe he's not a knife person. I wonder what his weapon of choice is then. His hands? Like he put on his ex-girlfriend? Evans was fine with describing that he cut Becky's body up to hide her identity, but he wouldn't stand for anyone saying he stabbed her. He merely chose to do the wrong thing when she accidentally fell. He said, quote, I had a knife in my hand. I made a mistake. I can't take it back, end quote. But this was referring to disposing her the way he did. The real murderer was apparently the dumbbells. Anytime Friendo would insist that Evans stabbed Becky, he would keep saying, no, don't say that. And he would kind of close his eyes like it was painful for him to hear. Then he went on to use another excuse, that he couldn't have stabbed her there in the liver. And for reference, this is where the liver is located, upper right-hand portion of the abdominal cavity. And if Becky was facing him, it would be on the left. Well, he said, I couldn't have stabbed her there because I'm a righty, in his words. And Friendo said, well, we don't know what position Becky was in when she was stabbed. Huh. Well, that threw Evans off again. So he tried to counter it by saying, well, I don't even know where the liver is. This makes no sense. And what you're about to hear is probably the craziest thing I've heard someone say to try to explain away a stab wound. He said that maybe Friendo should go call Becky's parents. Whew. Want to know why? Because he said, quote, maybe she already had a stab wound to her liver. Are you kidding me? This woman bled out. Did you really think anyone was going to buy that? This is not a medical condition. It's not a scar from a surgery that happened years ago. It's a stab wound with blood leaking into her body, blood that was clotting from sitting there over the course of hours that you hacked away at this poor woman. It's evil. And he's so unglued to think that anyone would believe that she already sustained this wound and was living with it, or it was a scar that the medical examiner mistakenly thought just happened on December 4th. No. Remember how I said there's always truth to lies? When Evans said that Becky started to froth at the mouth and gag in his vehicle out of nowhere, she probably did start to do that because that's exactly what would happen to someone who's stabbed in the abdomen and the neck. Let's not forget there's stabs to the neck. But it didn't happen out of nowhere. It happened when Evans tried to force himself on her, which was his intention from the minute he saw her and her friends at that bar. One of them was going to end up his victim that night, maybe not of murder, but his sexual desires. And sadly, it was Becky. And she resisted, so he ended her life. Now, because of the murder charge against Evans, the assistant district attorney was now involved in the case, and her name is Janet Albertson, and she's so good. She's worked on other high-profile cases, and I really like her. She's aggressive, and she's feisty. Well, she is building a case against Evans, and she could tell he was going to try to claim that this is one big accident. And the thing is, at the time that the autopsy was conducted and the report was done, it didn't go into full detail about head injuries or the lack thereof. Reason being, the liver wound had already been determined to be the cause of death, and the remains sadly were a Jane Doe, so no investigation had even started. Plus, there was no reason to assume that anyone would fight the cause of death, but now this man is. So Albertson didn't want there to be any wiggle room at trial. She could not take that chance. She needed the medical examiner to go back and examine Becky to make sure there was no way this fall could have caused her to die. But this posed a problem, one that I have never seen in any other case that I've talked about. Remember when the medical examiner makes a determination about a homicide that that's when the investigation begins? Well, the opposite is also true. When the medical examiner updates the manner of death and there's no homicide, and for example, in this case, when it's pending further investigation, well, as crazy as it sounds, it meant they wouldn't have a homicide charge to be brought against Evans. So they would have to let him go. They had nothing to charge him with because at that time, they couldn't take the risk. It's different now because now they could have held him on mutilating a corpse, but back in 2009, there was no law regarding corpse mutilation. So they had no choice. They had to release him and wait. Her family, I'm sure you can imagine, is shocked and confused. There's so many back and forth feelings. You don't know what is true, and the waiting is so hard. Barbara described it as gut-wrenching. Her mind was in a whirlwind. There was no rest until this man was behind bars. And of course, Albertson explained this to Becky's family. She knew that it was going to be really hard on them to know that Becky's killer was on the loose. But she assured them that this was to make sure he didn't get away with this. He's intelligent, he's well-spoken, he's cunning and convincing, even charming. So a jury, they could lean his way if they didn't make sure that, like he said, they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And I want to point out, Albertson explained one reason it's easy to believe that Becky felt comfortable with this stranger was because he didn't look threatening. And that was on purpose. The way that he was dressed. He presented this clean-cut, safe image, someone that was kind. And in the eyes of Suffolk County Police Department and District Attorney, he gave off the impression that he was harmless and trustworthy. The district attorney said that Evans was the kind of person that would not have been suspected of causing any harm to Becky. She said he was a predator. He knew how to make himself appear very nice and inviting. Remember that because this woman has thoroughly analyzed him, unlike the people online who call Becky stupid for, as they put it, quote, cheating on her boyfriend, end quote, and getting killed. That's not what happened here. And I better not see it in my comment section. I know none of you are victim-blaming people, but Becky was tricked. She was under the influence and she let her guard down, thinking that they were just going to smoke a little weed outside of her house. He probably parked right on her street. She thought it would take maybe 20 minutes or so and he'd be on her way, allowing her to go back inside, get some rest, and wake up at 6 a.m. for work. He even said that Becky told him she couldn't hang out long, so why do you think she would have agreed to go to his house? She didn't. And we'll get there. But after he's released, the medical examiner is back to assessing the injuries to Becky's body. Meanwhile, searches were being conducted inside Evans' car, and they also use cell phone towers to map the locations that Evans went in Connecticut. There's video footage from Port Jefferson Ferry. They see a video of Evans getting out of his car, going up the steps when it's going across the ferry, and he wasn't scared at all. He was on a mission. That's what he looked like. They located all the places his phone was in Connecticut, including a grocery store. And guess what? They asked for receipts and camera footage. Why go to another state to purchase duct tape and gloves? He crossed state lines to purchase this stuff. It's not something an innocent person does. The grocery store footage was very important because they were watching his body language. He said he was panicked and that he had to think so fast he didn't know what to do, and that's why he did this to Becky. Not true. This man was calm. He was a confident man thinking he was getting away with the murder. When he's at the store buying the duct tape and the gloves, he's not shaking. He wasn't fumbling and dropping things out of fear. He wasn't looking around anxiously. No. He was smooth. He was smiling, interacting with the cashier, taking his time. So much so, he even makes sure he got the right change and a receipt for his purchase. All of that was not a person that was panicked, all the while knowing he's about to use this stuff to wrap her up and set her on fire. Oh, those gloves didn't work so well, did they? I bet you he's the type to ask for a refund. That's how arrogant he is. And stay with me, please, because the medical examiner has some very interesting findings. According to Evans, Becky hit her head and died. Well, for a head injury to be fatal, it has to be pretty significant. It's possible, of course, but not likely from a fall like Evans described. Evans may have tried to be convincing. However, science, anatomy, and biology, to be more specific, let's start with the skull. There were no skull fractures. The skull is strong, it protects the brain, it's solid, and there's no evidence of blunt force trauma to the head at all. No brain bleeds, nothing, no inflammation or swelling of the brain. That was not the cause of Becky's death. However, Evans, being as clever as he was, may try to argue that the liver wound happened as a result of the fall, and it is possible, again, not likely that someone's liver can be lacerated from a fall, but it can happen. So remember those additional stab wounds to the neck? Well, the medical examiner wants to know whether these wounds were fatal or not, because this would be an additional cause of death if they happened before Becky died and not after she was dead. The prosecutor wanted to make sure they left no room for Evans to argue that those neck wounds happened because, as disgusting as it sounds, maybe he was attempting to cut off Becky's head instead of cutting each area like the ears and the nose. And it's very hard, so he hesitated. Well, the ADA wanted to make sure there was nothing that Evans could lean on. So under further examination, veins and arteries, they're located in the neck. And if one of those is cut while the person is alive, air gets sucked into that vein or artery, and that air travels to the heart. And when it does, it stops beating and the person dies. So Dr. Camphor takes a chest x-ray, which shows a pocket of air in Becky's heart. The blood air level in the heart shows that the neck wounds happened while Becky was alive. Air got sucked into that venous system and stopped the heart. So that stab wound would have killed her on its own, as well as the liver wound. So the official cause of death, multiple stab wounds of the neck and liver. Manner of death is back to homicide. Not only that, the investigators discover red stains throughout the vehicle that Evans drove that night, and it's determined to be blood. It had been dripping down the center console on both sides. And on the driver's side, the blood continued to drip downward in the space between the seat and the console and somehow made its way to the back of the driver's seat and inside the right rear door pocket. It went all the way down to the floorboards, where it then pooled. This was a significant amount of blood. It wasn't some frothing at the mouth because she was on drugs or sick, as Evans was claiming. That part of the story was to make an excuse about why Becky's DNA would be in his car. Nice try. The DNA matches to Becky's, and the odds it belonged to Becky were 1 in 28.9 quintillion. That's a number with 18 zeros at the end. No doubt this man killed her in his car, just like what happened to Samantha Josephson in the mistaken Uber driver case that I did. It took close to 2 months for all of this investigative work to be done, and meanwhile, Evans really thought he was going free. He planned a vacation to Atlantic City with his girlfriend, so he was pretty upset when they arrested him for the second time on February 8th, 2010. He said, quote, he was so upset about what happened to Becky. He wasn't even eating anymore or going to bars to pick up girls, end quote. He said he could just picture someone doing this to his sister. He's still playing the victim. He said he was forced to tell his girlfriend what he had chosen to do after the accident. And Frendo said he was really surprised that he would tell her that. Evan says, "Oh yeah, she was really upset and it's understandable." Frendo responded to that with, "Maybe she feels like she's next." And Evan literally tells him that that's exactly what his girlfriend said. Yeah, I don't know why she didn't run after the first time he was arrested. Evans actually asked Frendo if he could meet Becky's family to apologize. And of course he said, no, why don't you write him a letter instead? So that's what he did. And he stated, among other things, that, quote, "After she passed away, I should have reacted the right way, but like a self-centered idiot, I panicked. I'm so sorry for the things to her body," end quote. The police retained this letter as evidence, and wow, if that's not a sign of a sociopath, I don't know what is. And I'm echoing what the assistant district attorney said because she too referred to him as such, and she would know. She studied this man extensively, and as a matter of fact, after his interviews, she psychologically analyzed every one of his words, preparing to unravel each one of his lies at trial. The memorial service for Becky was held the week after she was identified. Barbara said the funeral was beautiful, with a pink casket with roses, Becky's favorite color, and flowers. So many people came to express their love for her. Their service was held at the St. James Funeral Home, and she was laid to rest at the Washington Memorial Park Cemetery in Mount Sinai, Long Island. It was a touching tribute to a beloved person who had left the world way too soon. I want to tell you the outcome at trial, but before I do, here's the message to all the people I saw online bashing this poor victim, blaming her for her murder. No, Becky was a young woman. She was only 24, and that may seem adult enough to know everything, but you don't. We don't. We're all going through life at our own pace. We have different life experiences, and maybe Becky wasn't fortunate enough to watch videos like this one or true crime shows on TV when she was growing up, and not only trying to navigate life, but navigate being a woman, because that's the reason Becky was murdered. Because she was a gorgeous woman that a man wanted to use for his pleasure. Don't get it twisted. Becky was innocent. She was kind and she was trusting, and she gave people the benefit of the doubt. Evans was a cunning criminal with a twisted mind and cruel intentions, and the ability to fool a woman who was out with her friends and her boyfriend having drinks like millions of other people do. There was nothing wrong about what she did. But on lipstickalley.com, there was an entire thread entitled "Woman Shamed and Blamed for Her Murder." And the author was specifically looking through comments on other YouTube videos about this case where people were lacing into Becky, calling her a cheater, saying that she got what she deserved for cheating on her boyfriend. Many comments I saw said, quote, "Oh, well, she had a boyfriend. Why is she giving out her number?" End quote. But there are ones that are much worse. Here are some of those lovely comments now. I'm going to put them on the screen. "So she died because she was being a hoe." Or what about this one? It just says, "Karma." How about this? Quote, "This is why you be loyal. Her fault." End quote. I'm disgusted. This one read, "R.I.P. Rebecca and Dan, find someone faithful, because to be blamed for the murder of a loved one has to hurt as much as finding out that the guy that killed your girlfriend was who she was potentially cheating with." End quote. These vile comments go on and on. And I didn't take these screenshots. They were posted by the person who wrote this post. I read so many of them and I was shocked. One reason I think this happened is because this case had so much information that was not talked about in some of the other videos that were created about Becky. They never mentioned Jennifer. They didn't examine all the interviews, the footage, and it leaves too much to be assumed. Not only that, even a cheater doesn't deserve to die. Sure, break up with them, but to say they deserve to be murdered and their family to suffer, that's extreme, and you can do better. We don't know her. We have no way to know if dating a guy for less than a couple months, if that, was a committed relationship, and it's not our place to judge. Becky didn't approach Evans. She was one of many women who were targeted that night, and each one of them were given unwanted attention. Have you ever wanted a man to leave you alone so bad that you gave him your number? I have. And I had a boyfriend when I did it. He took her phone just like he did with Jennifer's, and we don't know if he texted himself from her phone. We know none of these things. And even if she willingly gave a stranger her number, her boyfriend was there. She wasn't hiding it, and she had other guy friends like Jason. They were very close friends, but just friends. Not all partners think it's wrong to have friends of the opposite gender. Becky was the more the merrier type of person. She accepted everyone from everywhere she went. Both her mom and her best friend admitted that she used weed daily. It helped her in some way that seemed to benefit her. We don't know what Evans said to get Becky into his car. We don't. But the fact is, he mentioned drugs. So it makes it more likely than not that that's what he offered her. But what I want to point out is that this man had been listening in on her friends' conversations, trying to work his way into their group, like he was a part of it, talking to Becky and multiple women, making them feel uncomfortable with probing questions. I just gave you only a couple of scenarios that could have happened, but there are so many possibilities. It's not a woman being friendly that's the issue. It's not sharing some weed together, though both of those things can be deadly for women because of men like this one. It's how the hashtag text me when you get home movement arose from the fact that we can't feel safe alone. Most men don't know what it feels like to be in constant fear that someone will kill you to sleep with you. Can you imagine? It sounds unreal, but it's true. An influencer named Lucy Mountain, she shared a now viral screenshot of a WhatsApp message on her Instagram feed that said, "Text me when you get home." That's how this movement began. She went on to explain that, quote, "I've had conversations about how being hyper conscious of our safety is something that we've done throughout our entire lives. The deep sense of connection is one of fear. We've all shared our live locations. We have all changed out of our shoes. We have all held keys between our fingers. We have all made phone calls, both real and fake. We've all tucked our hair inside of our coats. We've all ran down dark roads, and we have all theorized our escape routes." End quote. Why? Because we're prey to some men. Everyone's a stranger before we get to know them, and we shouldn't have to worry that a man will kill us for having a joint with him or merely meeting up or exchanging numbers. Think how utterly absurd it is to think that such a minor interaction would warrant murder. Last thing I want to say on this rant that I thought was important is I'm sure if it was a guy who grabbed a smoke with another guy, no one would even give it a second thought. It's unfortunate that it seems like the responsibility lies with women to protect ourselves from predators and not the responsibility being with men not killing us. But sure, be careful, because as Barbara said it, there are demons out there that look like humans. So how did this case conclude? Evans is charged with second-degree murder. In New York State, second-degree murder is intentional murder. The state of mind needs to be that you acted in the moment with the intent to cause someone's death. When it came time for jury selection, there was a problem. Ultimately, many of the potential jurors were excused because of the gruesome nature of this case. The evidence that was going to be presented, it was bad. They didn't just have to look at it. They had to listen to what this man did to Becky in detail and analyze everything. Prosecutor Albertson told them, quote, "You're going to hear very, very gruesome and very, very detailed, graphic detail about what was done to Becky's body," end quote. And she warned potential jurors that they would hear how Evans cut off all of her fingertips, toes, ears, nose, hair, and 2 tattoos of a woman, and then set her body on fire. Albertson said that the evidence will show Evans did all of this not to obscure her identity, but to cover up the evidence of what he did. And if they were going to sit on this case, then they would have to hear this evidence. One potential juror, she said, "I can't do this. Just listening to you is disturbing, and I'm getting squeamish right now." So she was excused. One man said, while shaking, it would probably make him sick to his stomach. So he was excused. Another man said, "I've got major cotton mouth right now and my stomach is in knots." These potential jurors didn't make the cut because they couldn't stand to watch the cuts that Evan made to Becky's body. During jury selection, the defense attorney, William Keehan, was focused on whether the potential jurors believed that innocent people can be charged with crimes and if they thought detectives ever lied in court. You see what direction he was going in? Well, finally, by July of 2013, the trial began, and it went on for 4 weeks. Prosecutor Albertson showed everything that I told you about. Her belief is that Evans purposely appeared as someone trustworthy who just wanted to connect with other people who like to hang out and smoke and drink. He tried to blend in with Becky and her friends and be part of their group, and ultimately forcefully took Becky's and other women's phones and put his number inside under a fake name. Then he planned to use the things he pretended to have in common to lure one of them into his vehicle on December 4th, and it worked on Becky. However, he tricked her, and once inside, he attempted to force her to have sex with him, most likely at knife point. She resisted, and he stabbed her, either in the stomach first or the neck. He most likely grabbed one of her arms, pulling her forward towards his side of the car, and with his other hand, he stabbed her. That was why the blood was between the console on his side and hers. Once Becky began gagging and dying, Evans drove her back to his house, dismembered her, and you know the rest. This was no accident. This was the first time Becky's family heard all of those details, which I didn't even go into. This trial was disturbing. At one point, Barbara left in tears. She had tried her best to sit there through every single second, but it was too much to take in. When she heard details about how Evans said that the knife was bloody and dull after cutting off all of Becky's fingers and toes and ears and nose, and then it slipped while he was trying to use it to cut her hair, I can hardly get it out, so I can only imagine how heartbreaking that was. She ran away crying after that, but she did come back after that part was over and all the pictures were no longer being shown. She couldn't believe the sight of Evans when he walked into that courtroom. He was smiling, he was blowing kisses to his family, and according to her, he was smug and confident the entire time, and he showed no signs of remorse. She said that he did not care about the gravity of the situation, but he maintained his innocence. The defense tried to argue that Evans' version of what happened was true, that he never killed her. He just did the wrong thing after she died by accident. This is what he said, quote, "It was despicable, abhorrent, and shameful. There is no question that Evans Ganthier removed parts of Becky's body. There's no question that he set her body on fire, but there's no credible proof that he stabbed her in the abdomen. I know it's extremely difficult for you not to convict him right now because of what he did to her body. Probably 8 of you want to do so right now." He went on to explain that if the cause of death was the liver, the external wound was 6 to 8 inches below the liver, and nothing in between that wound and the liver was cut, and that was impossible in his words. He said, "It's, quote, incredible. It's hocus pocus," end quote. But the medical examiner countered this by explaining organs are not stationary. They move when we move. They don't just sit in one place. And yes, they can move while you're being stabbed, especially forcefully being pulled. So the knife could have missed her stomach and pierced her liver. Assistant District Attorney Janet Albertson said during her closing argument that people fall all the time. She said, quote, "You're not going to fall on a garage floor and lacerate your liver. The dumbbell that fell onto Rebecca is that one." And she pointed at Evans. And when she pointed at him and said that his thumbprints were on the duct tape, this monster gave her 2 thumbs up, mocking her. Can you believe that? The callousness of that gesture. It's actually frightening, and that sealed his fate. Jurors couldn't believe it. She also pointed out that there was blood found on both sides of the console between the front seats of Ganthier's car, and that pool of blood beneath the seat, it didn't come from transporting her body. That blood shouldn't be there. Innocent people don't do things like this. The jury deliberated for 5.5 hours, and they had a verdict. Guilty. There were cries and sobs. Barbara said this was the best day of her life, and she yelled, "Becky, we got him. We got you justice." And now for the impact statements before sentencing, and I'll keep it brief. Barbara addressed the court and said, quote, "I cry every day for my daughter, sometimes for hours at a time." And she turned to Evans with anger and she said, "I had to hear how you destroyed my Becky. No mother should ever see her daughter like that. I hate you. I hate you with every cell of my being, and I hope that everything you did to Becky is done to you." End quote. Larry said, quote, "His lack of remorse and indifferent attitude, the attitude he's shown through this entire ordeal, is unacceptable, unforgivable, and leaves me with no doubts that the next time a pretty girl refuses him, he would have no hesitation in taking their life, just as he took the life of our beautiful Becky." End quote. Evans actually responded, and he said that the evidence was weak. He said, quote, "I feel the appellate courts will see that I am an innocent man." End quote. And then he apologized to Becky's family for their loss. Well, the state Supreme Court Judge Richard Ambrose, he gave him the maximum prison sentence, and he said this: "Your version of events make no sense. It was unthinkably cruel, and it leads strong support to the idea that her death was not an accident. Neither I nor the jury believes you." And he imposed the maximum sentence, 25 to life, in a maximum security prison. But he will be eligible for parole on February 4th, 2035, and that just seems way too soon, and that is why I did this video. Remember me saying that I had to do it? Well, Barbara doesn't even like using Evan's name. She refers to him as it, because she said it's not human, it's a demon. It lied. It said it didn't do it. It is evil, pure and simple. Her mother said that telling Becky's story is important because this demon is eligible for parole. And she doesn't want it out to harm anyone else, to destroy another family like it has to theirs. So I hope you share this story. The ADA believes that he should never get out. This person has no remorse and accepts zero responsibility for this crime. It's not possible, in her perception, to help someone, to rehabilitate them, if they can't even admit what they did. Becky's mother feels a deep void that can never be filled. She misses Becky's laughter, even her complaints. Her presence is something that will never be replaced. And Evans will never know the true extent of what he has taken from this world, or the suffering that they had to endure. Becky's mom wears a heart-shaped necklace with a picture of her and Becky inside, and on the back, it's engraved, "Always my blessing." And she said that Becky was always a blessing since she was born until the last day she saw her. She said, "She's not just my baby, she's my friend." And I'm sorry, Barbara, I am so sorry. And I thank each and every one of you for giving your time to this family today. Please do not leave victim-blaming comments in my comment section. The family can see that. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye.